She was 19 years old, a geology student on her first real expedition, and she had exactly 4 hours of flashlight battery left when the ceiling came down. 300 feet below the surface of the Earth, in a limestone cave system that didn't appear on any official survey map, Margot Ellison heard the crack before she felt it, a sound like a giant snapping a tree trunk across its knee. And then the world above her simply collapsed, rock and dust and darkness, a wall of stone where a passageway had been, and silence, the kind of silence that doesn't exist on the surface of the Earth, the kind that presses against your eardrums like hands, the kind that makes you hear your own blood moving through your body. She expected to die. She expected to suffocate or to starve or to lose her mind in the black. What she didn't expect, what no one could have expected, was to find a light burning in a place where no light had any right to exist. And what that light revealed changed not only her understanding of where she was, but who she was and where she had come from. Margot grew up in Harlan, Kentucky, in a house at the end of Draper Hollow Road that sat so far back in the trees, you couldn't see it from the main road even in winter when the branches were bare. The house was small, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a warped linoleum floor, a bathroom where the hot water worked only between May and September. And it was old enough that the foundation had shifted, so the whole structure leaned slightly to the east, as if it were tired and looking for somewhere to lie down. Her mother, June Ellison, worked the front desk at a chiropractor's office in town, a job that paid $11.75 an hour and required her to smile at people whose backs hurt and whose patience was thin. Her father, Roy, had worked underground for 23 years at the Kemberton No. 4 mine before it closed, and after that he did odd jobs, fencing, grading driveways, cutting timber for a man in Evarts who paid cash and never asked questions. Roy Ellison was a quiet man, not quiet the way some men are quiet, where the silence is a wall they've built around something dangerous. Roy was quiet the way certain mountains are quiet, because everything that needed to be said had been said a long time ago, and what was left was just the living of it. He had thick hands, permanently darkened in the creases from years of coal dust that no amount of soap could remove, and he wore the same 3 shirts in rotation: a green flannel, a blue flannel, and a gray thermal that June had bought him at the Family Dollar in 2011. He loved his daughter with a ferocity that he expressed almost entirely through action. He built her a bookshelf when she was 9 because she'd stacked her library books on the floor and the dog had chewed the corner of a field guide to minerals. He drove her 47 miles each way to the Natural History Museum in Lexington when she was 12 because she'd read about a trilobite exhibit and couldn't stop talking about it. He sat on the porch and listened when she explained plate tectonics to him, and he nodded and he said, "That's something," and he meant it. June was different. June was warmth in motion, always touching Margot's hair, always calling her baby girl, always leaving notes in her school lunches that said things like, "You're my favorite thing that ever happened." June sang while she cooked, old hymns mostly, not because she was particularly religious, but because her own mother had sung them, and the melodies lived in her muscles the way a creek bed remembers the shape of water long after the water's gone. June worried. She worried about money, about the roof, about Margot walking to the bus stop in the dark, about Roy's cough that never quite went away, about the future in a place where the future always seemed to be arriving for other people in other towns. But she kept her worry quiet and her love loud, and between her and Roy, they managed to make that leaning house at the end of Draper Hollow feel like the safest place in the world. Margot would later say that she didn't know they were poor until she was 13. That's how well they did it. That's how thoroughly they loved her. She found her first cave when she was 11. A sinkhole had opened in the pasture behind the Tackett property after a week of heavy rain, and Margot had crawled to the edge on her belly and looked down into a hole that went deeper than her flashlight could reach. She could feel the air rising out of it, cool, wet, ancient air that smelled like minerals and time. And something in her chest opened like a fist unclenching. She didn't have words for it then. She would later call it recognition, as if some part of her had always known there were worlds beneath this one, and she'd just been waiting for proof. Roy caught her trying to lower herself into the sinkhole with a rope made of extension cords tied together, and he didn't yell. He sat her down on the tailgate of his truck and said, "Margot, I will take you into a cave, a real one, with real equipment. But you have to promise me you will never go underground alone." She promised. and he kept his word. The following Saturday, he drove her to Carter Caves State Park, 2.5 hours each way, and they walked through Cascade Cave with a guide who pointed out flowstone and rimstone dams and stalactites that had been growing for tens of thousands of years, a single drop of water at a time. Margot touched the wall of that cave and felt the cold of it in her palm, and she knew, the way you know your own name, the way you know which direction is home, that this was what she was supposed to do with her life. By the time she was 16, she had read every book about speleology in the Harlan County Public Library, which amounted to 3. She had ordered 7 more through interlibrary loan. She had mapped 2 small caves on her own, properly, with a compass and clinometer and surveyor's tape that Roy had bought her for Christmas, spending $67 he probably should have spent on a new alternator for the truck. She had joined an online forum for cavers and was corresponding with a retired geologist in Bowling Green who told her she had a natural gift for spatial reasoning. She was making straight A's in every science class her school offered and was running out of science classes to take. Her guidance counselor, a well-meaning woman named Mrs. Dearborn, who had been in the same role for 31 years, told her she should consider nursing or dental hygiene. Margot said she wanted to study geology. Mrs. Dearborn looked at her over her reading glasses and said, "Honey, that's a long road for a girl from Harlan." Margot said, "I know how long it is. I've measured it." She got into the University of Kentucky on a combination of a small academic scholarship, a federal Pell Grant, and $4,200 that Roy and June had saved over 6 years in a coffee can kept in the back of the bedroom closet. Roy drove her to Lexington in August, the truck loaded with 2 suitcases, a box of books, a pillow from home, and a quilt that June had made from old flannel shirts. He helped her carry everything up to her dormitory room on the 4th floor, and he stood in the doorway, and he looked at her, and he said, "You call us." "Every Sunday," she said. "I will, Daddy." He said, "I mean it." And he drove home, 183 miles, with the windows down because the truck's air conditioning hadn't worked since 2015. Margot thrived. She thrived the way a plant thrives, when it's finally been moved into the right kind of soil. She took Introduction to Physical Geology her first semester and earned the highest grade in a class of 114 students. Her professor, Dr. Elena Vasquez, a hydrogeologist who had spent 12 years studying karst systems in Central America, noticed her immediately. Not because Margot was the most polished student, but because she was the most hungry. She asked questions that students didn't usually ask until graduate school. She stayed after lectures. She brought in her own hand-drawn cave surveys and asked Dr. Vasquez to critique them. By the end of her first year, Dr. Vasquez had invited her to join a summer research project mapping unexplored sections of a cave system in the Daniel Boone National Forest. It was unpaid. Margot took it anyway. She worked mornings at the campus dining hall, 5:30 a.m. to 10 a.m., 5 days a week, $9.50 an hour, then drove to the field site in a university van with 3 graduate students who treated her like a mascot at first and like a colleague by the end. That was the summer she learned to move through the earth the way some people learn to move through water, with respect, with attention, with her whole body listening. She learned to read rock the way her father read weather, instinctively, through feel and smell and the particular quality of silence in a passage. She learned that caves are not dead places. They breathe, they shift, they are alive in ways that most people never understand because most people never go deep enough to feel it. She learned to trust her hands in the dark, to navigate by touch when her headlamp died, to stay calm when a passage narrowed to a space barely wider than her shoulders. She learned what fear tastes like, copper and adrenaline, and she learned to swallow it and keep moving. She was 19 years old, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The expedition that changed everything was not supposed to be dangerous. It was October of her sophomore year, and Dr. Vasquez had received a tip from a local landowner named Dale Messer, a 71-year-old tobacco farmer whose property sat on a limestone ridge in Wolfe County. Dale's grandfather had spoken of a cave entrance somewhere on the back of the property, hidden behind a stand of old-growth hemlock, but no one had been able to find it until a drought that summer lowered the water table and revealed a narrow opening at the base of a rock shelf. Dale called the university because he was curious and because he liked Dr. Vasquez, who had bought tomatoes from his wife at the Campton Farmers Market for 3 years running. Dr. Vasquez organized a preliminary survey team. Herself, a graduate student named Kai Okonkwo, another graduate student named Lisa Pruitt, and Margot. 4 people. 2 days of mapping. Standard equipment, helmets, headlamps, backup lights, cave packs, survey gear, food and water for 48 hours, an emergency bivouac kit. They filed a trip plan with the county rescue squad, as protocol required. They told Dale they'd be out by 4 p.m. on Sunday. They entered the cave at 9:15 a.m. on Saturday, October 14th. The entrance was tight, a belly crawl through 20 feet of muddy passage, barely 14 inches high. And then it opened into a room that made all 4 of them stop and stare. The ceiling was 40 feet above them, draped with formations that looked like frozen waterfalls, white and amber, and a pale orange that caught their headlamp beams and scattered them like light through stained glass. Stalactites hung in clusters so dense they resembled chandeliers. The floor was covered in a thin layer of calcite flowstone that crunched softly under their boots like frozen snow. It was, Margot would later struggle to describe it, it was like stepping into a cathedral that had been building itself for 1,000,000 years, with no congregation and no need for one. Dr. Vasquez whispered, "My God," and Kai said nothing at all, and Lisa, who was not generally given to sentimentality, said, "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." They spent 7 hours in that first chamber and the passages that branched off from it, surveying, photographing, taking rock samples, and water temperature readings. The cave system was extensive, far more extensive than anyone had anticipated. Every passage they followed led to more passages. Every room opened into another room. They found evidence of water flow at multiple levels, suggesting the system was at least partially active. They found formations that Dr. Vasquez said she had never seen outside of textbook photographs, helictites growing in spirals that defied gravity, soda straws so thin they were translucent, cave pearls sitting in rimstone pools like offerings left by a civilization of water. By 4 p.m., they had surveyed only a fraction of what was accessible, and Dr. Vasquez made the decision to camp underground and continue the next morning. They set up bivouac in a dry alcove off the main passage, ate energy bars and rehydrated soup, and took turns sleeping while one person stayed awake to monitor conditions. It was standard, it was safe, it was fine. The collapse happened at 6:42 a.m. on Sunday. Margot knows the exact time because she had just checked her watch, a battered Casio that Roy had given her for her 18th birthday, one of the few pieces of equipment that survived. She was 300 feet from the bivouac, alone, having walked ahead to photograph a side passage that she'd noticed the day before, but hadn't had time to investigate. Dr. Vasquez had told her to go no further than the first junction and to be back in 20 minutes. Margot was 12 minutes in when she heard it. The crack. Not a sound that came from any one direction. It came from everywhere, from the rock itself, from the bones of the earth, shifting in a way they had not shifted in thousands of years. She turned, already running, and she saw the ceiling of the passage behind her sag and buckle, and then come down in a cascade of limestone blocks, some of them the size of refrigerators, falling with a sound like the end of the world. Dust exploded outward, hitting her like a wall of talcum, filling her nose and mouth and eyes. She fell backward, arms over her head, and felt rocks strike her helmet, her shoulders, her legs. One piece caught her left ankle, and she felt something give. Not a clean break, she would later learn, but a fracture of the lateral malleolus, a crack in the bone that runs along the outside of the ankle. And she screamed, but the scream was swallowed by the roar of falling stone. And then it stopped. And then there was silence. The kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier than sound. She lay on her back in the dark. Her headlamp had been knocked off her helmet and lay somewhere to her left, its beam pointing at nothing. And she breathed, and she listened, and she understood, with the cold clarity that comes only in the moments when your body knows something before your mind admits it, that she was cut off. The passage behind her was gone. Where there had been a corridor of limestone wide enough to walk through, there was now a wall of broken rock, floor to ceiling, extending back further than she could see. Between her and Dr. Vasquez, between her and Kai and Lisa, between her and the entrance, between her and the surface, between her and the sky. She didn't panic, not immediately. She had been trained for this. Not this specifically, because no training can prepare you for the actual physical reality of being sealed inside the earth, but for the response. She retrieved her headlamp. She checked herself for injuries. The ankle was swelling rapidly, already too painful to bear full weight. Her left forearm had a gash that was bleeding, but not arterially. Her ribs ached on the right side, bruised probably, maybe cracked. She could breathe. She could think. She could move, though not well. She checked her pack. She had 1 liter of water, 2 energy bars, a first aid kit, a 50-foot length of static cord, a space blanket, her survey notebook, 2 pens, a compass, and a backup flashlight with an estimated battery life of 4 hours. Her headlamp had maybe 2 hours left, 6 hours of light total. After that, darkness. Real darkness. The kind that is not merely the absence of light, but a substance, a presence, a thing that fills your eyes and your mind and begins to dismantle, piece by piece, your sense of where your body ends and the void begins. She sat with her back against the collapsed pile, and she assessed. The air was breathable. That was the first and most important thing. If the collapse had sealed the passage completely, with no gaps, she would have a finite supply of oxygen, and the math on that was merciless. But she could feel a faint movement of air against her face, coming from somewhere deeper in the cave, which meant there was still a connection to a larger air volume. That bought her time. How much time depended on whether anyone could reach her from the other side of the collapse, and that depended on whether Dr. Vasquez and Kai and Lisa were alive, and whether the collapse had blocked them too, and whether Dale Messer's phone had service, and whether the county rescue squad had ever dealt with a cave collapse before. Too many variables, too many unknowns. She could not control any of it. She could only control what she did in the next hour, and the hour after that, and the hour after that. She tried shouting. She pressed her mouth to the collapse pile and screamed their names, Elena, Kai, Lisa, until her throat was raw, and she listened, and she heard nothing, not even an echo. The rock absorbed her voice like a sponge absorbs water. She banged on the rocks with a carabiner, a rhythmic pattern, 323, the universal signal for distress, and she listened, and she heard nothing. She did this for 30 minutes, alternating between shouting and banging, and the silence that came back each time was so complete that she began to wonder if she was already dead and just hadn't noticed. She was not dead. She was alone, and she was hurt, and she was 300 feet below the surface of the earth in a cave that no one had known existed 3 weeks ago. But she was not dead. She rationed her light. She turned off her headlamp and sat in the dark for intervals of 30 minutes, then turned it on for 5 minutes to check her surroundings, to look at her ankle, to study her map, to remind herself that she still existed in 3 dimensions. The darkness between those intervals was indescribable. She had been in dark caves before. She had turned off her light for a few seconds, the way every caver does at least once, to experience the absolute dark, and she had always felt a thrill, a shiver, a delicious edge of fear that was safe, because she knew she could turn the light back on at any time. This was not that. This was the dark as a permanent condition. This was the dark as a place you lived, not a thing you visited. And it did things to her mind that she had not expected. In the first hours, she heard sounds, dripping water. That was real. The faint creak and tick of rock settling. That was real too, and every sound made her flinch, made her wonder if another collapse was coming, if the ceiling above her was about to do what the ceiling behind her had already done. But she also heard other things. Music, a radio playing somewhere far away, the melody distorted beyond recognition. Her mother's voice, calling her name, a dog barking. These were not real. She knew they were not real. Sensory deprivation in total darkness produces auditory hallucinations. She had read about this. She understood the neurology of it. But knowing that something is a hallucination does not make it less vivid, does not make it less terrifying, does not stop you from turning your head toward the sound of your mother's voice in a place where your mother cannot possibly be. She slept in fragments, 20 or 30 minutes at a time, her body jerking awake at every sound, real or imagined. She dreamed of sunlight. She dreamed of the porch at Draper Hollow, the particular way the afternoon light came through the oak tree and laid a pattern of shadows on the boards. She dreamed of Roy sitting in his chair, not speaking, just being there, the weight and warmth of his presence. She dreamed of June's hands braiding her hair when she was small, the gentle tug of it, the smell of coffee and laundry soap. She woke each time into darkness so complete that for several seconds she didn't know if her eyes were open or closed, and she had to touch her face to find out. 12 hours passed, then 20. She drank her water in sips, so small they barely wet her tongue. She ate half an energy bar, chewing each bite until it dissolved, trying to trick her stomach into thinking it was full. Her ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, and the pain had settled into a deep, constant throb that matched her heartbeat. She could still move it, but only with a grinding sensation that made her nauseous. She fashioned a splint from her survey notebook, folded into a rigid L shape and secured with strips of athletic tape from the first aid kit, and she used her static cord to bind it tight. It wasn't good. It was enough. By the 24th hour, she had made a decision. She could stay where she was and wait for rescue that might not come, or she could move deeper into the cave, following the air current, looking for another way out. The air had to be coming from somewhere. Every cave system that breathes has at least 2 openings. She knew this. She had studied this. It was a fundamental principle of cave meteorology. If she could follow the air to its source, she might find a passage to the surface, or she might find a dead end, or she might fall into a pit, or she might run out of light in a passage too narrow to turn around in and die wedged in the rock like a cork in a bottle. The odds were not good, but the odds of staying were not good either. Rescue teams, even experienced ones, could take days to breach a major collapse, and she didn't have days. She had maybe 2 liters of metabolic water left in her body before dehydration began to shut down her kidneys. She had maybe 4 days before starvation made her too weak to move. She had maybe 6 hours of light. After that, she would be crawling blind. She chose to move. She oriented herself by the air current, faint, barely perceptible, but consistent, flowing from deeper in the cave toward the collapse behind her. She turned and moved into it, into the unknown passage she had been walking toward when the world fell down. Her headlamp carved a tunnel of light through darkness that seemed to have texture, seemed to resist the beam, seemed to close in behind her as she moved. The passage was walkable at first, 4 feet wide, 6 feet high, the floor uneven but navigable. She used a broken stalactite as a crutch, wedging it under her left arm to keep weight off her injured ankle. Every step was a negotiation with pain. She counted her steps because counting gave her something to hold on to, a thread of rationality in a place where rationality was beginning to fray. 100 steps, 200, 300. She marked her route on the wall with a pen. Arrows pointing back the way she'd come in case she needed to retreat, in case rescue came to the collapse and she wasn't there. The passage narrowed. Of course it narrowed. Caves do this. They test you. They ask you how badly you want to keep going. They make you choose between the known misery behind you and the unknown misery ahead. The ceiling dropped to 4 feet, then 3. She crawled. The floor was wet now, covered in a thin film of water that soaked through her knee pads and her gloves. The air was colder, 54 degrees she estimated, based on the way it felt against her sweating skin. The current was still there, still flowing toward her, still promising that somewhere ahead there was space, there was an opening, there was a way out. She followed it the way a drowning person follows a rope. She crawled for 2 hours. She knows this because she checked her watch obsessively, the way a person dying of thirst checks their canteen. 2 hours of moving through rock on her hands and knees, dragging her injured ankle behind her, her headlamp growing visibly dimmer as the battery drained. The passage branched twice. Both times she followed the air, wetting her finger and holding it up the way her father had taught her to find the direction of a breeze in the woods. Both times the air pulled her to the left, deeper, further from the surface, further from everything she knew. And then her headlamp died, not gradually, not a slow fade to amber and then to nothing. It died the way a switch is flipped. 1 second, she could see the rock in front of her face, the gleam of water on limestone, the shadow of her own hand. The next second, she could see nothing, nothing at all. The darkness was so total that her visual cortex began to generate its own images. Phosphenies, the neurologists call them. Flashes and spirals of false light produced by a brain that cannot accept the absence of visual input. She saw colors that weren't there. She saw shapes that weren't there. She saw her mother's face, for just a moment, floating in the dark like a photograph projected on smoke, and then it was gone. She switched to her backup flashlight. 4 hours of battery. 4 hours between her and permanent darkness. She kept moving. The passage opened into a small chamber, maybe 15 feet across, maybe 10 feet high. She sat down on a flat rock and drank the last of her water and ate the second half of her energy bar, and she allowed herself, for the first time, to cry. Not sobbing. She didn't have the hydration for sobbing, but a quiet leaking of tears that ran down her filthy face and dripped off her chin onto the cave floor, where they would eventually become part of the water system, would eventually filter through limestone and emerge in a spring somewhere downstream, and someone would drink them and never know that they were drinking a 19-year-old girl's grief. She cried for 5 minutes, then she stopped. She stopped because she heard something. Not a hallucination. She was certain of this, because it was not music, not a voice, not any of the phantom sounds she had been hearing. It was water, running water. Not the drip, drip, drip that had been her constant companion for 30 hours, but the sound of a stream, a real stream, moving with purpose through rock. She followed the sound. The passage that led out of the small chamber descended steeply, 30 degrees, maybe more, and she half crawled, half slid down it, breaking with her hands and her good foot, the rock tearing at her palms through her gloves. The sound of water grew louder. The air grew warmer. Not warm, but warmer than it had been, 58 or 59 degrees, and wetter, saturated with humidity that she could feel condensing on her skin. She came around a bend in the passage, and the passage opened, and she saw something that stopped her breath in her chest. Light. There was light ahead of her. Not daylight. It was the wrong color for daylight. Too warm, too amber, too steady. Not a flashlight. It didn't move, didn't flicker the way a handheld light flickers. It was a glow, a soft, amber, diffuse glow, emanating from somewhere around the next corner of the passage, painting the walls in tones of honey and gold. It was impossible. She was, by her best calculation, 300 to 400 feet below the surface of the earth, in a cave system that had been sealed for centuries, if not millennia. There was no source of artificial light. There was no source of natural light. There was no explanation for what she was seeing, and yet she was seeing it. And she was not hallucinating, because hallucinations in total darkness don't cast shadows, and this light was casting shadows. She moved toward it. She could not have done anything else. The light pulled her forward the way the air current had pulled her forward, the way the cave itself had been pulling her forward since she was 11 years old, lying on her belly at the edge of a sinkhole and feeling something open in her chest. She dragged herself around the bend, and the passage widened and the ceiling lifted, and she emerged into a space that made her forget her ankle, forget her thirst, forget her fear, forget everything except the fact that she was seeing something that no human being had seen in a very, very long time. The chamber was enormous, cathedral scale, the ceiling vaulting upward 60 or 70 feet into darkness that her failing flashlight couldn't penetrate. A stream ran through the center of it, maybe 6 feet wide, clear as glass, flowing over a bed of smooth river stones that gleamed amber and white. The walls were covered in formations, flowstone and draperies and massive columns where stalactites and stalagmites had met and fused over millennia. But that wasn't what stopped her. What stopped her was the light. It was coming from the walls themselves. Specifically, it was coming from thick veins of a mineral that ran through the limestone in branching patterns like the roots of a tree. And this mineral was glowing, not reflecting light, not refracting light, generating light. A soft, steady, amber luminescence that filled the chamber with the warmth of candlelight, that made the formations shimmer, that made the surface of the stream dance with reflected gold. Margot pressed her hand against one of the veins and felt warmth. Not heat, but warmth, the temperature of living skin. The mineral was smooth, almost waxy to the touch, and where she pressed, the glow intensified briefly, as if responding to pressure before settling back to its steady radiance. She had never seen anything like it. She had never read about anything like it. In 4 years of obsessive study, in hundreds of papers and textbooks and forum posts, she had never encountered a description of a mineral that produced sustained bioluminescence. No, not bioluminescence. That was a biological term. This was a geological phenomenon. A mineral luminescence, a chemiluminescence perhaps, or something else entirely. something that didn't have a name because no one had ever observed it. She stood in that chamber, barely able to stand, dehydrated, starving, her ankle screaming, her ribs aching, her hands torn, and she felt a wave of emotion so complex and contradictory that it defied categorization. Terror, because she was still trapped, still dying, still 300 feet underground with no way out. Awe, because she was looking at something that might rewrite portions of mineralogy and geology. And something else. Something quieter, deeper, harder to name. Recognition. The same feeling she'd had at 11 years old, lying at the edge of that sinkhole. As if the earth had been waiting to show her this. As if this was the thing she'd been walking toward her entire life and she just hadn't known it. She explored the chamber. She couldn't help it. The scientist in her was stronger than the survivor, or maybe they were the same thing. Maybe the act of observing and documenting was itself a survival mechanism, a way of insisting that she was still a person with a purpose and not just a body waiting to die. The glowing veins were not evenly distributed. They clustered near the stream, following the water, branching upward through the rock in patterns that suggested they were precipitating from mineral-rich water, seeping through fractures in the limestone. She broke off a small piece. It came away easily, crumbling slightly at the edges like chalk, and it continued to glow in her palm, dimmer than in the wall, but still unmistakably luminous. She wrapped it in a strip of cloth from her first aid kit and placed it in her pack. She wrote everything down in her survey notebook, her handwriting shaky but legible, filling 4 pages with observations, measurements estimated by eye, diagrams of the vein patterns, the chamber dimensions, the stream flow direction, the temperature of the rock, the color and intensity of the light. She noted the time, 2:17 p.m. on Monday, October 16th. She had been underground for 53 hours. It was while she was documenting the chamber that she found the carvings. They were on the far wall, partially obscured by flowstone that had grown over them like skin healing over a wound. She almost missed them. She would have missed them if the light from the glowing veins hadn't hit the wall at exactly the right angle, casting microshadows in the shallow grooves that made them visible. She moved closer, and she brushed away a thin layer of calcite deposit with her fingers, and she saw them clearly, and her hands began to shake. They were symbols, dozens of them, carved into the limestone wall at approximately chest height, covering an area roughly 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall. They were not natural. They were not random scratches from animal claws or geological fracturing. They were deliberate, organized, repetitive, the same symbols appearing in sequences, in rows, in patterns that suggested language, or at least proto-language, a system of meaning created by a mind capable of abstraction. And interspersed among the symbols were images, recognizable images. A human hand, fingers spread, a 4-legged animal, a deer possibly, or an elk, a circle with lines radiating from it that could have been a sun or a flower or a representation of the glowing veins themselves. And at the center of the panel, larger than the other images, drawn with obvious care and repeated emphasis, a figure, a human figure standing upright, arms raised with lines emanating from its hands, lines that appeared to connect to the vein patterns in the surrounding rock, as if the figure was touching the light, or drawing the light, or made of the light. She sat down on the floor of that chamber, and she looked at those carvings, and she understood, with a certainty that went beyond evidence, beyond proof, beyond the careful skepticism that her training demanded, that someone had been here before her. Someone had stood in this exact spot, in this light, and had been moved to record what they saw. And they had done this a very long time ago. The flowstone that partially covered the carvings represented centuries of mineral deposition at minimum. Based on the growth rate of flowstone in similar cave environments, roughly 1 inch per 100 years, though the rate varied wildly depending on water chemistry and flow, the carvings could be hundreds or thousands of years old, pre-Columbian, pre-European contact. Indigenous people who had found this place, who had sat in this impossible amber light, who had known about the glowing veins before anyone with a university education had ever set foot in Kentucky. She thought of her father. She didn't know why, or rather, she did know why. She thought of Roy sitting on the porch, listening to her explain plate tectonics, saying, "That's something," with perfect sincerity. She thought of him buying her the clinometer and surveyor's tape for Christmas, $67 he didn't have. She thought of him driving her to Carter Caves, 5 hours round trip, because she needed to touch a cave wall, and he understood that need, even though he couldn't name it. She thought of him saying, "Margot, I will take you into a cave, a real one, with real equipment," and she thought he would have loved this. He would have stood in this chamber and looked at this light, and he would have been quiet for a long time, and then he would have said, "That's something," and he would have meant it more than he had ever meant anything. She didn't want to leave the chamber, not just because it was beautiful, though it was the most beautiful place she had ever been, or would ever be, but because it was warm, and it was lit, and it felt, irrationally, like the safest place in the cave. But the air current that had led her here continued through the chamber and out the other side, following the stream, and she had no food and no water beyond what she could drink from the stream. And she knew that if she stayed, she would eventually be too weak to move, and then the chamber would become her tomb. A beautiful tomb, an extraordinary tomb, but a tomb nonetheless. She drank from the stream. She drank deeply, greedily, and the water was cold and clean and tasted like minerals, like the earth itself, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She filled her empty water bottle. She ate her last energy bar, her final one, 240 calories, the last food she would have. She wrapped 3 more pieces of the glowing mineral in cloth and placed them in her pack, and she stood up and she followed the stream. The passage beyond the glowing chamber was different. The light faded behind her, but didn't disappear entirely. Smaller veins of the luminous mineral appeared sporadically in the walls, like stars in a tunnel of rock, giving her just enough light to see by if she turned off her flashlight. She turned it off. She walked by the light of the earth itself, following the stream, stepping carefully on the slick river stones, her ankle a constant fire, her ribs grinding with every breath. The passage twisted, rose, fell, narrowed, widened. She lost track of time. She lost track of distance. She existed in a state beyond exhaustion, a state where her body moved on its own, and her mind drifted, unmoored, through memories and half-dreams and fragments of songs her mother used to sing. She thought about what she would tell them. If she got out, when she got out, she rehearsed it in her mind. The chamber, the mineral, the carvings, the light. And she knew that she sounded insane, that any description of what she had seen would sound like the ravings of a woman who had been alone in the dark for too long. She would need the samples. She would need her notes. She would need someone to come back here with proper equipment and proper lighting and proper documentation and see it for themselves. But even then, even with evidence, even with photographs, she knew there would be skepticism, resistance, the institutional inertia of a scientific establishment that did not like being told that the Earth contained things it didn't know about. She was a sophomore. She was from Harlan, Kentucky. She had no publications, no credentials, no authority. She had a fractured ankle and a pocket full of glowing rocks and a story that sounded like a fairy tale. She kept walking. The stream grew larger. Other tributaries joined it, seeping from cracks in the walls, and the passage grew larger to accommodate the increased flow. The air was distinctly warmer now, and she could smell something she hadn't smelled in days. Green, living things. The unmistakable organic smell of vegetation, of photosynthesis, of life that needed sunlight to exist. And if she could smell it, that meant there was an opening nearby. That meant the surface was close. She moved faster, limping badly now, using the wall for support, her good hand pressed against the limestone and her injured ankle dragging. The smell grew stronger. The air moved faster, flowing past her now with purpose, with direction, pulling toward the opening like water toward a drain. And then she saw it. Not the amber glow of the mineral, not the white beam of a flashlight. Daylight. Gray, overcast, filtered through leaves and branches and the canopy of a forest. But daylight, real daylight, the light of the surface, the light of the sky, the light of the world she had left 62 hours ago. The opening was small, 3 feet wide, 2 feet high, hidden behind a curtain of ferns and moss at the base of a limestone bluff. The stream flowed out of it and dispersed into a shallow pool choked with leaves. She crawled through the opening on her belly, the water soaking her to the chest, and she emerged into a forest. Dense, old growth, the trees so tall and thick that the canopy blocked most of the sky. And she lay on the ground, on the wet leaves and the cold dirt, and she looked up at the gray clouds through the branches, and she cried. not the quiet leaking of tears she had managed in the cave. This was sobbing, full body, convulsive, her voice cracking and breaking, her ribs screaming, her whole self pouring out of her onto the forest floor. She cried for 20 minutes, maybe longer. She didn't check her watch. When she stopped, she sat up. She looked around. She had no idea where she was. She could have been a mile from Dale Messer's property or 10 miles. The forest offered no landmarks she recognized. The sky offered no sun to navigate by. The clouds were solid, a uniform gray that gave no indication of direction or time. She was soaking wet, she was starving, she was injured, and she was lost on the surface, which was a significant improvement over being lost underground, but was still a long way from being rescued. She checked her phone. Dead, of course, had been dead since the first hour. She checked her watch, 11:43 a.m. on Tuesday, October 17th. She had been underground for approximately 74 hours, 3 days and 2 hours. She followed the stream downhill. Downhill was a bet. Most streams in this part of Kentucky eventually led to roads, or at least to hollows where people lived. She walked for 40 minutes, limping, stumbling, falling twice on the steep, leaf-covered slope before she heard the sound of a motor. A chainsaw, she realized. Someone was cutting wood. She moved toward the sound, pushing through undergrowth that tore at her clothes and her skin, until she emerged from the tree line into a cleared field, and she saw a man standing next to a pickup truck, cutting a fallen oak into rounds. He was wearing an orange safety vest and ear protection, and he didn't see her at first, didn't hear her shouting over the scream of the saw. She walked across the field toward him, and he turned, and he saw her, and the chainsaw died in his hands. She must have looked like something from a nightmare. She was covered in mud and cave dust from head to foot. Her clothes were torn, her face was scratched and swollen. Her left ankle was twice the size of her right, wrapped in a makeshift splint held together with tape. She was shaking violently, whether from cold or adrenaline or both. The man set down his chainsaw and walked toward her quickly, pulling off his gloves, and he said, "Jesus Christ, honey, what happened to you?" His name was Vernon Sloan. He was 58 years old. He lived a quarter mile down the road. He had a wife named Patty and a cell phone with 3 bars of service. She said, "My name is Margot Ellison, and I was in a cave, and it collapsed, and I've been underground for 3 days, and I need you to call 911, and I need you to call this number." And she recited Dr. Vasquez's cell phone number from memory, all 10 digits, because she had memorized it the day the expedition started, because you always memorize your team leader's number, because that's what you do. Vernon Sloan did not ask unnecessary questions. He did not ask her to explain. He did not stand there with his mouth open. He put his arm around her shoulders, gently, carefully, as if she might break. And he walked her to his truck, and he set her in the passenger seat, and he draped his jacket over her shaking body, and he called 911, and then he called the number she had given him, and he stood next to the truck with his hand on her shoulder while they waited, and he said quietly, "You're out now. You're okay. You're out." Patty Sloan came running from the house with a thermos of coffee and a blanket, and she wrapped the blanket around Margot's legs, and she pressed the thermos into her hands, and she said, "Sip it slow, baby. Don't gulp it." Margot sipped the coffee, and it was too sweet and too hot, and it was the finest thing she had ever tasted, second only to the cave stream, and she held the thermos in both hands and felt the warmth seep into her palms, and she thought of Roy's hands, coal-darkened in the creases, holding the steering wheel of the truck on the 5-hour drive to Carter Caves. Dr. Vasquez was alive. Kai was alive. Lisa was alive. The collapse had sealed the passage on both sides, Margot's side and theirs. But on their side, the main passage to the entrance remained open, and they had made it out within 4 hours of the collapse. They had been on the surface for 2.5 days, working with a rescue team from the Red River Gorge Search and Rescue Unit, trying to breach the collapse from their side, calculating air volumes, estimating survival times, refusing to say the word that everyone was thinking. When Dr. Vasquez got the phone call from Vernon Sloan's number, she was standing at the cave entrance with Kai, reviewing a drilling plan, and she answered, and she heard Vernon say he had a girl here who said her name was Margot Ellison, and Dr. Vasquez dropped the phone. Kai caught it. Dr. Vasquez sat down on the ground and put her head in her hands and sobbed, and Kai told Vernon they were coming, and they drove 14 miles on dirt roads to Vernon Sloan's property in 11 minutes. The ambulance took Margot to Wolfe County Hospital, where they x-rayed her ankle. Fractured, as she'd suspected, the lateral malleolus cracked cleanly, and her ribs, 2 of them cracked, not broken, and they cleaned and stitched the gash on her forearm, and they started IV fluids because she was severely dehydrated, and they fed her broth, just broth, because her stomach had been empty for so long that solid food would have made her sick. Roy and June arrived at the hospital 5 hours later, having driven 160 miles from Harlan at a speed that Roy would never discuss. June came through the door first, and she saw Margot in the hospital bed, and she made a sound that Margot had never heard her make. Not a word, not a cry, just a sound, a raw exhalation of relief, so intense it was almost pain. And she crossed the room in 3 steps and put her hands on Margot's face and looked at her and said, "Baby girl, baby girl, baby girl." Roy stood in the doorway. He looked at his daughter. His jaw was working, the muscles in his face doing something that Margot had never seen before, and she realized with a shock that her father was trying not to cry. He crossed the room, and he sat on the edge of the bed, and he took her hand, and he held it, and he didn't say anything for a long time, and then he said, "That's my girl," and his voice broke on the last word. She told them about the chamber. Not that night. That night was for holding and being held, for the physical reassurance of touch, for the simple miracle of being alive in a bed with clean sheets, and people who loved her nearby. She told them the next morning, when she was lucid and rested, and her ankle had been properly set in a fiberglass cast. She told Dr. Vasquez first, because Dr. Vasquez was a scientist and would ask the right questions. She opened her pack and showed her the survey notebook. 4 pages of observations written in shaky handwriting by flashlight. She showed her the mineral samples, still wrapped in cloth. And when she unwrapped them, Dr. Vasquez went still, because the samples were still glowing. Dimmer than they had been in the cave, but unmistakably, undeniably luminous. A soft amber warmth emanating from crumbled pieces of rock in a hospital room in Wolfe County, Kentucky. Dr. Vasquez picked up a piece with tweezers. She held it under the fluorescent hospital light. She held it in the shadow of her cupped hand. She set it in the dark interior of a bedside drawer and closed the drawer and opened it again. It glowed. It was glowing. In her 22 years of geological research, she had never seen anything like it. She said, "Margot, do you understand what this could be?" And Margot said, "I know what it is. I don't know what it means yet, but I know it's real." The weeks that followed were a controlled explosion. Dr. Vasquez contacted colleagues at the university, then colleagues at other universities. The mineral samples were sent to 3 different labs for analysis: a geochemistry lab at UK, a materials science lab at Virginia Tech, and a mineralogy lab at MIT. The results came back within 10 days, and they were, in the measured language of peer-reviewed science, extraordinary. The mineral was a previously unidentified crystalline compound, a calcium-strontium silicate with trace amounts of europium, cerium, and an isotope of phosphorus that the Virginia Tech team had to run twice because they didn't believe the first result. The luminescence was not bioluminescence, not phosphorescence, not fluorescence in the traditional sense. It was a sustained chemiluminescence driven by a slow-rate exothermic reaction between the europium-doped crystal matrix and water, specifically the mineral-rich groundwater that permeated the cave system. The reaction was self-sustaining as long as water was present. It had been going on in that chamber for an estimated minimum of 10,000 years. 10,000 years. 10,000 years of light, burning softly in a chamber that no one could see, illuminating formations that no one was admiring, casting shadows for no one. Until Margot. The carvings were harder to investigate immediately. Getting back to the chamber required either clearing the collapse, which would take months, or finding the exit point where Margot had emerged and working backward through the stream passage, which would require a major expedition with proper safety protocols. Dr. Vasquez began planning both approaches simultaneously. In the meantime, she shared photographs of the carvings from Margot's phone, which had died but retained its stored images, with Dr. James Blackwood, an anthropologist at the University of Kentucky who specialized in pre-Columbian indigenous cultures of Appalachia. Dr. Blackwood studied the photographs for 3 days and then called Dr. Vasquez and spoke for 45 minutes without pause. The symbols, he said, bore similarities to markings found at only 2 other sites in the southeastern United States, both associated with the Adena culture. a pre-Columbian civilization that inhabited the Ohio Valley and surrounding regions from roughly 1000 BCE to 200 CE. But the Messer cave carvings, if they were authentic, and Blackwood stressed the if, appeared to include symbolic elements that had never been documented before. The figure with radiating lines from its hands, the connection between the figure and the vein patterns in the rock. It suggested not just awareness of the luminous mineral, but a relationship with it. Ritual, spiritual, possibly even practical. A people who had found this light in the earth and had built meaning around it. Margot followed all of this from her parents' house in Harlan, where she had gone to recover. She sat on the porch with her cast propped on a stool and her laptop on her knees, and she read every email, every preliminary report, every excited message from Dr. Vasquez. Roy sat next to her, not understanding most of it, not needing to understand most of it, just being there. June brought her food and coffee and didn't ask questions, sensing that her daughter was processing something larger than a cave collapse, something that had to do with who she was going to become. Because here is what the cave did to Margot Ellison, beyond the ankle and the ribs and the dehydration and the 3 days of darkness that would give her nightmares for years. It showed her something. Not just the mineral, though the mineral was enough to build a career on, and she would build a career on it, a significant one. It showed her that the earth keeps secrets, that beneath the surface of the world we know, the world of roads and houses and jobs that pay $11.75 an hour, there are other worlds, older worlds, worlds that have been waiting in the dark for someone to find them. And it showed her that she was the kind of person who could find them. Not because she was special in any cosmic sense, not because the universe had chosen her, but because she had done the work. She had read the books and drawn the maps and learned the science and crawled through the dark on a fractured ankle. And when she saw something impossible, she had not looked away. She had looked closer. She had taken notes. She returned to the university 6 weeks later on crutches. She finished her sophomore year with a 3.94 GPA. She declared a double major in geology and anthropology. She began working with Dr. Vasquez and Dr. Blackwood on a joint paper about the Messer cave system, the mineral, the carvings, the implications. She secured funding for the return expedition, writing a grant proposal so compelling that it was funded on the first submission, which Dr. Vasquez said had never happened in her experience. In May, 7 months after the collapse, a team of 12 geologists, anthropologists, cave rescue specialists, and Margot entered the Messer cave through the stream exit that Margot had crawled out of, and they followed the stream passage back to the glowing chamber. It took them 9 hours. They had proper equipment, proper lighting, proper communication. They had a safety plan and backup teams and a medical kit that could handle anything short of surgery. They had everything Margot hadn't had. And when they reached the chamber, every single one of them stopped. Just as Margot had stopped. Just as the people who had carved those symbols into the wall had stopped, however many centuries or millennia ago. They stood in the amber light, and they looked at the walls and the formations and the stream and the glowing veins, and for a long time, no one spoke. Then Dr. Vasquez said very quietly, "You were right." And Margot said, "I know." Not arrogantly, not boastfully. She said it the way you say you know the sun will rise, because you've seen it, because you were there, because some things don't require consensus to be true. The paper was published 14 months later in the journal Nature Geoscience. Margot was the lead author. She was 20 years old. The mineral was formally named Ellisonite, over her objections. She had wanted to name it after the cave, or after Dale Messer, or after the people who had carved the symbols, whose name no one knew. But Dr. Vasquez overruled her, and the committee agreed, and so Ellisonite it became, and Margot's name was permanently inscribed in the geological record, in the catalog of minerals that the earth has offered up to human knowledge. Dale Messer came to the lecture she gave at the university. He drove 2 hours and wore a clean shirt, and he sat in the back row of the auditorium, and he listened to a 19-year-old girl from Harlan, Kentucky, explain to a room full of professors and graduate students and journalists that his family's farm sat on top of one of the most significant geological and anthropological discoveries in the history of Appalachian research. After the lecture, he found her in the hallway, and he shook her hand, and he said, "My grandfather always said there was something special under that ridge. He said the mountain hums at night. I thought he was just old and hearing things." Margot said, "He wasn't hearing things, Mr. Messer." The mountain was humming. Roy and June were in the audience too. Roy sat in his green flannel, the same one he'd been wearing for a decade, and he watched his daughter stand behind a podium and speak with authority and grace about geochemistry and indigenous culture and the luminescent properties of europium-doped calcium strontium silicates. And he understood perhaps one word in 5, and he understood everything. June cried through the entire lecture, quietly, her hands folded in her lap, tears running freely down her face, the way the creek runs after a heavy rain. Fully, loudly, if tears could be loud, her whole heart filling the auditorium. Afterward, in the parking lot, Roy put his hands on Margot's shoulders and looked at her. His eyes were wet. His jaw was working again, the way it had at the hospital. He said, "That's something, Margot." And then he said something he had never said before, something that had been building in him for 20 years, for the whole duration of her life, a sentence that cost him everything he had because Roy Ellison was not a man who spoke his interior life aloud. He said, "I always knew you were going to find something nobody else could find. I just didn't know it would be so beautiful." She hugged him. She held on to her father in a parking lot in Lexington, Kentucky, and she felt his thick arms around her, and she smelled motor oil and wood smoke and the particular smell of the green flannel she had known since she was born, and she thought about the dark, about the 62 hours of darkness, about lying on the floor of a cave, hearing her mother's voice in sounds that weren't there, about the moment her headlamp died and the world went black. And she thought about the light that came after, the impossible, inexplicable amber light that had been burning in the earth for 10,000 years, waiting. Not waiting for her specifically, not waiting for anyone specifically, just waiting, the way the earth waits. Patient, silent, immense, holding its secrets in the dark until someone crawls far enough, hurts enough, refuses enough times to give up, and finds them. She would go on to complete her PhD at 26. She would lead 4 more expeditions into the Messer Cave system, ultimately mapping 3.7 miles of passage and discovering 2 additional chambers containing Ellisonite deposits. She would identify 137 distinct carved symbols and work with Dr. Blackwood and a team of indigenous cultural historians to develop a preliminary understanding of their meaning. She would become, by 30, one of the most respected young geologists in the country, and one of the few people in the world who could speak with authority about the intersection of geological science and pre-Columbian indigenous knowledge systems. She would buy her parents a new house. Not a big house, not a fancy house, but a house that didn't lean, with a foundation that was level and hot water that worked year-round. June cried when she saw it. Roy walked through every room, touching the walls, and he said, "This is good work, Margot," like she built it with her own hands. Like she had. She still has nightmares. She still wakes in the dark sometimes and does not know, for several terrible seconds, whether she is in her bed or in the cave. She still carries a flashlight everywhere, in her bag, in her car, in the pocket of her coat. Because the memory of darkness is not a thing you recover from. It is a thing you carry. It becomes part of your weight, part of the load you bear, and you learn to walk with it the way you learn to walk with any wound. It doesn't heal completely. It doesn't have to. It just has to not stop you. She keeps a piece of Ellisonite on her nightstand. The university asked her to return all her samples, and she returned all of them but one. A piece roughly the size of a walnut, the first piece she had broken from the wall of that chamber, wrapped in cloth from her first aid kit, carried through 3 days of darkness in a cave pack on the back of a 19-year-old girl crawling towards something she couldn't name. It sits in a small glass box that she bought at a craft store for $4.99, and at night, when she turns off the lamp, it glows, faintly, steadily. An amber warmth in the darkness of her bedroom that says, "You were there. You saw it. It was real." If you're watching this right now, if you're in your own kind of darkness, your own cave, your own collapse, I want you to hear what this story is really about. It's not about a mineral. It's not about a scientific discovery, though those things matter, those things are extraordinary. It's about a girl who was taught by 2 people in a leaning house at the end of a hollow road that the world had things in it worth finding, and who believed them, and who kept crawling when every rational part of her mind told her to stop. It's about the fact that the light was always there. 10,000 years it was there, burning in the dark, not waiting for permission, not waiting for someone worthy, just burning the way the earth does what it does, without audience, without recognition, without anyone to say, that's something. The light didn't need Margot to exist, but Margot needed the light, and she found it. Not because she was lucky, not because she was chosen, because she refused to stop moving. Your light is there. It's been there. It's been burning in the dark for longer than you know, in a place you haven't reached yet, and the only way to find it is to keep going. Not with optimism. You don't need optimism. Not with confidence. You don't need confidence. Just with refusal. The plain, stubborn, unglamorous refusal to stop crawling towards something you can feel but can't yet see. That's enough. It has always been enough.